Hi and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim, this is Dr. K. Today we'll be talking about Romans in Scotland. We are the Romans. We just looked at the Iron Age people of Scotland, but is that isolation about to be challenged?
Well, I think so, because the Romans haven't been on our island before, and we've had all these thousands and thousands of years to ourselves. The Romans, of course, don't visit the north of the British Isle. First, they visit the south, but they do visit the north, our territory, with an army of occupation about 69 AD. It's not the first time that the Romans and people of the island have been in contact with each other, because we talked about this before, that the Roman Empire founded on long-distance trade, and they were quite interested in the tin in Cornwall. And so they do actually, this kind of piques their interest in the area in general. And, the Romans launch an invasion force against the Britons, who, that's that word, Briton, sounds very much like the Pict word, Britanni, Prytanni, so just keep that in mind for later on. Mm-hmm. So they launch an invasion force, and there's a bit of a struggle. There's an Iceni uprising under Queen Boadicea, as we used to call her, but now she gets called Boudica. But she subsequently lost, and so that meant that the southern parts of Britain were actually under Roman occupation. But in the kind of 69, 70, I hesitate to say the late 60s in case you think of the 1960s and flower power, but you're too young for that. The Roman governor Agricola reasserts Roman power on the island, and his campaign comes to us in written form thanks to the works of Tacitus. And Tacitus really, in a sense, gives us our first noble savage. You think of the term noble savage, think of Rousseau and the Enlightenment. I know you always do anyway when you're thinking of that. But you do actually get this idea of the nobility of the victims of the Roman campaign. Now, it's probably just him being really subjective and trying to kind of knock down Agricola a little, or knock down what the Romans are actually doing. But you do get, local warriors kind of painted as noble savages, a la Mel Gibson, who's moved to the other side of the History Hut. He likes it better on my side. Tacitus's writings also said that Agricola campaigned further north in the island than he actually did, and this was to make the Roman victory seem more complete. But the Agricolan victory is really quite superficial, because there are no Roman towns or settlements really in our part of the island, whereas if you go south of the border, there's, Colchester and Londinium, and, there's a real urban environment created. So we just get kind of walls and signal forts, but the walls are pretty spectacular. And in the 80s, the Romans again did some reconnaissance missions up the Forth, and they built some forts and aqueducts, and they actually start what could be considered to be a road system. And in fact, it's not until the early 18th century that the roads in Scotland are really altered. Until then, you just get the kind of cattle roads, the drove roads, the kind of width of 2 cows, and then everybody can kind of use that. So from about 80 AD until the 1720s even, there's not much change in terms of kind of transportation infrastructure, as we might say today. But, the Roman imperial policy changed again in 83 AD when the emperor ordered his forces to push north again. I mean, this is virtually the kind of western edge of the empire. And remember, the Roman Empire is absolutely massive, so they're always looking for new things. So they want to see what's actually there. So they're ordered to push north, and they do this until they reach Stonehaven, which is quite far north on the northeast coast, but they were worried about revolts from the local native people, and they couldn't get the local people to kind of stand and fight them, which is what the Romans are really good at. They're not so good at people jumping out of trees and from behind bushes at them. They like to kind of have the set piece battle. And so, of course, if you were one of the local native people, it would be in your best interest to try the guerrilla attack rather than say, oh, there's a big Roman army, I think I'll get my 10 guys and we'll try and, stand up to them. But in any case, under one of the leaders, Calgacus, the local people do actually stand and fight at a battle called the Battle of Mons, Graupius. And that's in 84 AD, and of course, as expected, suffer a stinging defeat. And this is the great Roman battle that Tacitus would write of. And it's hard to say exactly where it is, but there's a good chance it's near Inverary. With a kind of instead of using the word Graupius, the word Grampian starts to be used. So in Scotland, you get Grampian TV, and there's a Grampian mountain range, and so that's because the Romans seem to have recorded it incorrectly. So we have that anyway. So Agricola staged a strategic withdrawal, because after all, you're just kind of up there to show a bit of might and then get out. And then he had his fleet sail around the northern waters to find out if it actually was an island or if there was, more landmass after that. And Tacitus wrote all of this down. And Agricola seems to have done such a good job that he gets invited back or called back to Rome, where all the action was. And it's his successor that decides to draw the frontier at the Forth and Clyde line, and that's where it remains for about 20 years until just about 105 AD. The locals burned the Roman forts all the way south of there. So that's the kind of first kind of resistance. The Roman forts were always, of course, at natural junctions like rivers, and they linked them with roads, and they covered the forts. With timber frame barracks and guard posts, and then they had mile posts, and actually. One of the old premiers of Alberta, Ernest Manning, was on a tour of Scotland, and he was up at a place called Inchtuthil, and the students were doing an archaeological dig, and they dug up some of the Roman nails, and so he bought them and brought a shoebox worth of them back to the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta. So it's kind of interesting. If you like material culture, you can actually go up and touch some rusty old nails that are a couple of thousand years old. Anyway, the Romans kind of decided that they'd had enough. Every time they kind of advanced, they would be attacked by these kind of random bands of people. So they decided that they would build a wall, and it was the Emperor Hadrian that decided on the wall. He visited the island in about 122 AD and chose the site of the wall himself. And of course, it's known as Hadrian's Wall. And it was a 73-mile long stone wall, and it had, I think, 16 forts along the way. And of course, it's a fairly narrow part of the island, so it goes from the east. That would be the west. It goes from the west to the east and kind of cuts right across that top part of the island. And this wall took the place of the frontier. So you build a big wall, then you can stay behind it and you don't have to suffer all of these attacks. And it's meant to perhaps restrict or supervise the movement of rebel native tribes. And it's used on and off for about the next 300 years. And if you go to the north of England, you can actually walk along sections of Hadrian's Wall. So the stone from the wall had actually been used by local farmers and local people over thousands of years. So the Hadrian's Wall stone is really part of all the stone walls in that kind of area. So it's really, really neat. And this last year they decided to light it up. So it's 73 miles and it's all lit up. And you can take a little bus tour that goes from one end of the wall to the other. So it's quite spectacular. And I'm always saying to you, I don't really know any real jokes. I can never remember them. But the one joke that I do know is the Hadrian's Wall joke. And it's, legion after legion of Roman soldiers go across the wall and they don't come back. And everybody's like, oh man, it's such a rough place over there. Like, what's going on? And then this one time, a Roman soldier staggered back to his signal fort, and his commander says to him, what's going on? What's out there? And he says, there's nothing we could do, sir. It was an ambush. There was two of them. So you get this, the martial legend of the people north of the wall. So Scotland then is separated from Roman Britain by frontier walls, and it's not a new tactic for the Romans, but it's certainly a new thing for the people in the area, because they were used to roaming kind of north-south, and that's why I said you remember the word Britons for later on, because it looks as though those original Stone Age people that we talked about could actually have been people from the south all the way up to the north, but in this period they actually are cut off from each other, and so they start to see each other as different people. So there's the tribes to the north, and then there's the Briton tribes to the south. So it means that it boxes people in the north in, and it keeps them together for about 400 years. So it's like a giant firewall. And so people on the other side of it start to, instead of having, maybe 50 tribes, it starts to decrease and decrease until you're really down to about 2, the Caledoni and the Métis. So, obviously, there's other groups as well, but those are the 2 main ones. So it means that they lose contact with other Britons, and it gives a certain unity to the north that you wouldn't have had before. But just as importantly, the longest actual occupation of any strength beyond the wall is about 5 years. So people aren't really all that much influenced by Romans and their culture. And I always think this is really funny, because Scottish people were like, yeah, those Romans, they didn't teach us anything. And everybody else in the world's like, oh, the Roman legacy, it's so wonderful, and in law and in philosophy and in building and in roads and in art and absolutely everything. And we're like, yeah, they didn't teach us a thing, we just held them out, so it's really an unusual approach. And of course, as I said, it's a World Heritage Site and has been since about 1987. And there's actually a guy called Alan Whitworth, who his job's been to sketch every brick in the wall, and so he's been sketching for at least 13 years, and he sketches each side of the wall. So he's to preserve the largest remaining chunk, a 13-mile stretch in Cumbria and Northumberland counties, and so they hired him as a New Zealand native with an archaeology degree and a capacity for solitary work. Well, you'd have to if you were doing that. And he's to draw the estimated number of bricks is 800,000, so he's recording the wall's minutest details for posterity, and he says it takes him about 16 months to do 1 kilometre. And I just thought it was funny, and there was an article in, I think it was People magazine, and it said that he had been divorced for a long time, and now was dating Jenny Stone. He's drawing a stone wall. He gets divorced, and then he marries or dates Jenny Stone, and she was a custodian at the Roman fort when he met her. So it's just like, well, that's it really tailors your occupation to your dating life as well. But there's been all sorts of really cool activity around Hadrian's Wall. We know that there are letters. We have letters sent home from Roman soldiers to their families, and they're just like the ordinary things. Please, Mum, send another plum cake, and I need another pair of socks and gloves. And it turns out that a lot of the soldiers that were on Hadrian's Wall weren't actually Roman soldiers at all. They were what the Romans would have formerly called barbarians. So there'd have been, Goths and all the other groups that had moved into Europe and would eventually overrun the Roman Empire. So there's a big dig near Hadrian's Wall. And they found a suspected refugee camp, which would have housed tribespeople fleeing south from a breakdown of society north of the imperial border in the 3rd century AD. So they've got this refugee camp, and the guy that's the director of excavation is Dr. Andrew Burley, and he says that they're unusual buildings, and it looks as though they may number into the hundreds. And it's a different kind of building. The Roman soldiers didn't build roundhouses, but were billeted in large rectangular barracks. But these are roundhouse barracks. And so it says it's quite possible what we have here is the Roman army providing for these people, creating a temporary refuge for the most vulnerable people from north of the wall. And that these people might actually have helped to feed the army and traded with the soldiers. And that would have been regarded as traitorous and collaboration in the eyes of the rebel tribes to the north. So that's kind of interesting as well. So you've got refugees being brought behind Hadrian's Wall to protect them, and then for a long time people said, well, how much contact could there actually have been with the Romans? And it didn't look like there was a lot, but as usual, archaeologists, have come to the rescue, and we found out that the Romans and the people north of the wall often lived in close contact and traded with each other. And this is just from the Romans in Scotland, BBC Education Scotland. That some tribes in southern Scotland were friendly with the Romans and moved closer to Roman forts for protection. They picked up Roman habits, worshipping Roman gods and using Roman coins. Some even served as soldiers in the Roman armies. And then it says Romans also traded with them at special marketplaces across Scotland. Timber, leather hides and furs were bought by Roman merchants. And we know that a large Highland bear was taken from the territory to the city of Rome, and it was slaughtered by gladiators on the opening day of the Colosseum amphitheatre. So it's like really, really crazy. And of course, since then, there have been all sorts of silver hoards found. So we know that there's actually quite a bit of Roman money that finds its way up quite far into the country. So lots of silver coin dating back to about 200 AD. So it looks like the Romans would have tried to buy off different groups, and then those groups probably worried either about being seen as collaborators or maybe just worried that they'd lose it, buried the hoards. So then probably must have forgotten where they were after that. Oh, little book, The Making of Scotland from the First Settlers to Roman Times, editor Gordon Barclay. Pardon me. There's also some other things. There was a rare Roman artifact found buried in the river just on the outskirts of Edinburgh. And it was spotted, it's kind of funny, it was spotted by a ferryman who was rowing across the river from Cramond to the Dalmeny estate when he saw the face of a cat in the mud. So he returned at low tide with a shovel, thinking, it was just the kind of cool wee thing, put it in his garden. And it turned out that it was this massive piece that weighed 1.5 tons, was 4 foot 6 inches long, 2 foot high, and it was the first statue of its kind found in Scotland. So it looks like a kind of like a big lion. And they think they found other similar finds in military frontier areas in the Rhineland and in the on the Danube, so over in Germany. But this looks as though. It's the fourth Roman sculpture found in the UK that showed the relatively rare subject of a human being devoured by an animal, but it's the largest and best preserved. So it shows that there were some key people, like important people in the area, because it's probably a funerary stone. And then just another thing, because it's the bailiwick of archaeologists, they're always finding stuff. And this is from the Scotsman from about a decade ago, and it turns out that Scotland has the earliest frontier in the Roman Empire. Now everybody thought it would have been Germany that had the earliest frontier, but Scotland's actually the earliest frontier. They colonised Perthshire 15 to 20 years before previously thought, and the study suggests that the Scots engaged in trading with the Romans, giving them beer and mutton in return for Mediterranean delights of wine and olive oil. And it says near Dunblane, the troops were thought to have built a 20-mile long series of wooden forts and watchtowers known as the Gask Ridge about 80 AD, so the period that we were talking about. And it says archaeologists from the University of Manchester have uncovered evidence that shows the ridge, known to be Britain's oldest frontier, was actually built at least a decade before that, predating a barrier in Germany and making it the oldest such structure in the whole of the Roman Empire. So it's really cool. So this guy, Dr. David Williscroft, who's the director of the Roman Gask project and archaeologist, says that they've been working on this, and the Gask Ridge, it looks as though it was built actually earlier in 70 AD. So that period, 69-70 AD, right at the start, which is really cool. And from that study, he says that from the organic remains in the native settlements, they show no sign of being destroyed, and farming appears to have flourished through that whole period. So it looks like an easy kind of occupation. And this is shown by the remains of pollen buried in the soil that indicates that soon after the Roman conquest, the number of weeds started to fall, suggesting that cattle were grazing the land more intensively, so even more settled than it had been before. Stuff I'd never think of, weeds and pollen. I wonder what they could tell from my back garden. the amount of weeds there, they'd be like, oh, there hasn't been much activity in this
Modern
place.
lawn mowing hadn't quite reached this
That's
area.
right. They hadn't invented the lawnmower yet. So he said you can tell from the number of weeds it was low-level grazing before the Romans arrived, and afterwards more animals must have been raised, leading to more grazing. The surprise is how peaceful it all seems to have been. Wherever we've looked, we found peace, tranquility and prosperity, which was not at all what we were expecting. So really, really kind of interesting stuff about the Romans, and it's always changing. We're always adding to it because people keep digging up things that aren't just Stone Age but are from the Roman period too.
Well, I think that wraps up part 1 of our discussion of the Romans in Scotland. Join us again for part 2.